Seaspark sat at the far end of Moonstone Pier, where the fishing boats moored and the gulls came to quarrel over guts and scales. On windy days, the smell of salt and diesel drifted through the studio's open doors, tangling with the sweet sting of molten glass. Visitors loved that mix. They said it felt honest, like something handmade should keep the scent of its birthplace. Coral Price had built the place from a single furnace and a card table 15 years earlier. She shaped glass like other people shaped dough, confidently, quickly, trusting her hands. Yet she also shaped stories, coaxing them the way she coaxed a bubble into a vase. A detail trimmed here, a flourish spun there, enough to keep clients charmed and inspectors satisfied. Her pieces gleamed in boutique windows, from Seattle to San Diego, and no one ever asked why Seaspark's 2 aging kilns had no digital logs, or why the vent hoods rattled like loose teeth when the wind came off the Pacific. This summer was the busiest yet. Cruise ships anchored offshore twice a week, spilling tourists who wanted souvenirs that proclaimed hand-blown on the Oregon coast. Coral hired 2 seasonal assistants and, for the first time, an apprentice, 19-year-old Dylan Marquez, who biked down from the community college art program and wore earphones even while sweeping cullet off the floor. He possessed the 2 things Coral valued most in beginners: silence and calloused fingers. Dylan turned out to be observant. During his second week, he asked why the annealing kiln's safety interlock was taped back. Coral told him gently that the sensor had a habit of tripping when the shoreline humidity spiked, and that replacing it would cost more than the whole kiln was worth. "We keep eyes on each other instead," she said, patting his shoulder. "Old school trust." He nodded, though the crease in his brow remained. Coral watched him go and made a mental note: keep Dylan occupied with predictable tasks, the kind that warmed loyalty and discouraged questions. The second Friday of July dawned glass flat and blue. A touring bus had reserved an 11 a.m. demonstration, and Coral wanted all 3 benches flaming to impress the guests. She arrived before sunrise, unlocked the rolling doors, and started the big furnace herself. When the first beads of sweat formed beneath her bandana, she felt the usual thrill. The day coming alive, the dance beginning. By 9, the crew was in motion. Mara, the senior assistant, gathered a cylinder for stemware. Ben, fresh from the university's craft program, practiced cane pulls near the glory hole. Dylan swept, fetched, and politely kept out of everyone's way. The annealing kiln, a squat, masonry-lined box the size of an upright piano, ticked along at 520 degrees, ready to receive the morning's production. At 10:30, the bus of tourists arrived. Coral greeted them in the storefront, her voice bright enough to drown the hiss of torches. She guided them behind the viewing rail, narrating every twist of pipe and flare of colour, praising her crew by name. Cameras flashed. People clapped when Mara punctuated a goblet, and Coral, sweating freely now, smiled as though applause were air she could breathe. Half an hour later, with the demonstration winding down, she noticed Dylan carrying a tray of finished pieces toward the annealer. Nothing unusual, except he paused at the kiln door and peered inside, as if measuring space. Coral turned back to her audience, explained how gradual cooling prevented stress fractures, and invited them to the sales counter. By the time she looked again, Dylan and the tray had vanished behind the kiln's metal door. A minute after the crowd dispersed, a dull bang sounded from the workshop. Mara glanced around. "Was that thunder?" Ben shook his head. "Weather's clear." Another bang, louder, followed by frantic thuds, a fist against steel. Mara's lips parted. That's coming from the annula. Coral's stomach tipped. She sprinted, heat from the open furnaces baking her cheeks. At the kiln, she heard a voice inside, muffled but unmistakable. "Help! Coral!" The door handle sat in its locked position. The interlock wires Coral had taped months earlier dangled loose. Hot air leaked around the seal. Oh God, Dylan must have leaned in to reposition a piece, lost his balance, fallen inside. The spring-loaded door, free of its safety stop, had swung shut, latching automatically. "Get pry bars," Coral barked. Ben ran. Mara grabbed a long steel Marva paddle and wedged its flat edge between door and frame. Coral added her own leverage. The kiln groaned, the hinge bolts squealed. Inside, Dylan's banging slowed. Coral envisioned the temperature creeping into the 600s, the air becoming unbreathable, flesh blistering. "Move," Ben returned with a crowbar. Between them they talked until the latch screws popped. A gust of scorching air burst out, singeing eyebrows. Coral and Ben dragged Dylan, limp and coughing, onto the concrete. His arms were red, his eyelashes curled, but he was alive. Someone hit the emergency shutoff. Someone else dialed 911. Coral cradled Dylan's head and told him he was safe. He whispered something she couldn't catch, eyes rolling white. Then the sirens approached, and everything blurred under strobing lights. EMTs stripping gloves, firefighters checking for structural ignition, a marshal asking questions she barely processed. It wasn't until the ambulance doors slammed and the engine pulled away that Coral felt the full weight of what had happened. The marshal, a square-jawed woman named Justice Ward, irony not lost on Coral, handed her a card. "We'll need a statement regarding your safety protocols. The state inspectors will probably join tomorrow." Coral managed a nod, though her pulse hammered harder than any furnace blower. Safety protocols, the taped interlock, the missing maintenance log. If investigators saw those, C-Spark would close on the spot and fines would follow until the studio drowned in debt. Everything she'd built would shatter. Mara came up. "The firefighters cut mains power. They'll let us back in after they verify temps, but production's done. What do we tell people?" Coral swallowed. Shards crunched beneath her sneakers. The truth was raw and combustible. She had to anneal it, cool it slowly, shape it into something that wouldn't explode. "Dylan ignored procedure," she said, the words forming before her conscience could object. "He climbed in to adjust a piece. We warned staff never to lean inside. The latch engaged. Tragic accident." Mara's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Ben, at a distance, hunched over a bucket, retching. Coral steadied herself. A story, once blown, couldn't be reheated. You had to get it right the first time. That evening, Coral sat alone in the storefront, lights off, watching sunset bleed across the pier. Reporters had already called. So had Dylan's mother, sobbing over the line. Coral repeated the same script. "Your son will recover. He violated written safety rules. We're cooperating fully." She convinced herself it wasn't a lie, only selective emphasis. There were rules posted on the bulletin board, generic OSHA printouts mostly ignored. And yes, Dylan had entered the kiln. No one needed to know the door should never have latched, or why the interlock hung lifeless on a strip of duct tape. Yet later, at home, her husband Theo found her sitting on the porch steps, shoes still dusted with silica. "Core," he said, "you're shaking." She forced a laugh. "Long day?" "You're writing payroll on a cereal box." She looked down. Indeed, she'd scribbled numbers across a cartoon toucan. The figures blurred as tears welled. Theo put an arm around her. She thought about confessing everything, letting him carry half the weight. But if he repeated it, even by accident, the story could crack. So she inhaled, pictured molten glass revolving on a blowpipe, and slid her feelings into that orange core where they would glow unseen. Dylan spent 2 nights in the burn unit. Blisters speckled his shoulders. Singed lungs made speech painful. Coral visited with balloons and promises of full wages until he healed. His mother, Paula, clutched Coral's hands, thanking her for quick action. Coral accepted the gratitude like a shard slipping under skin. On Monday morning, the state safety inspector arrived, briefcase in hand. Coral greeted her with photocopies titled C-Spark Hot Shop Safety Procedures, freshly assembled over the weekend. They described in crisp bullet points rules that had either never existed or been ignored for years. A digital maintenance log had been backdated, printed, and placed in a binder. The inspector walked the floor, noting that the annular now sat dark, its latch removed entirely, pending replacement. Coral kept her tone measured, humble. She admitted small lapses, a clogged vent screen she'd somehow missed, because a minor flaw made the larger picture appear credible. By the time the walkthrough ended, only 2 citations remained, both fixable with modest fines. C-Spark, she was told, could reopen within a week if requirements were met. Mara and Ben watched from behind the cold work table. When the inspector left, Mara whispered, "We really selling that note card novel as procedure?" Coral tightened her ponytail. "We're protecting everyone's jobs, including yours." Ben wouldn't meet her eyes. Dylan returned to the shop 6 weeks later, thinner, voice raspy, but determined to finish his apprenticeship. The other assistants greeted him like a soldier back from war. Coral held out a glossy brochure for the fall workshop schedule and told him he could ease into instructor duties once the doctor cleared him. He nodded, yet something flickered in his gaze, a question unsaid. During lunch, he wandered the work floor, knuckles grazing equipment, absorbing the heat and smell. He paused at the annealing kiln, now fitted with a shiny new interlock and bold warning decals. Coral saw him touch the latch, as if confirming reality. That afternoon, he asked to speak privately. They sat in Coral's cramped office, surrounded by invoices and glass color samples. "I remember what happened," Dylan began, voice almost swallowed by the hum of the mini-fridge. "I was loading the last tray, and I saw the taped wires. I thought maybe I could fix them. I bent in to look, slipped, door slammed." He coughed. "Thing is, if the interlock wasn't disabled, the elements should have shut off. Heat wouldn't rise that fast." Coral folded her hands. "It shouldn't have been disabled," she agreed, and waited. Dylan met her eyes. "Inspector thinks I disobeyed rules, but there were no posted rules about that door. She said you gave her documentation." Coral chose each word like tweezers lifting slivers. "I showed her our updated procedures. I will never again allow shortcuts. I'm profoundly sorry you were hurt." Dylan exhaled through his teeth. "People online are calling me reckless. My scholarship panel saw the news. They might drop me if they think I'm careless." Coral felt the kiln heat again, remembered hauling him onto the concrete. "What do you want, Dylan?" He looked away. "Truth, I guess." A gull screeched outside. The pier bell clanged once. Coral's heartbeat filled the silence. "Truth is complicated," she said finally. "If C-Spark shut down, everyone here would lose their livelihood. You, me, Mara feeding 2 kids, Ben paying loans. I made a bad decision about that sensor. But we can fix things going forward. I'll fund your tuition next term. I'll sign whatever reference you need. Help me keep the studio alive, and you'll have a place to grow." "Bribe," murmured a voice in her conscience. She ignored it. Dylan studied his bandaged palms. "So the story stays the same," Coral answered with the faintest nod. He rose and left without another word. That night, Coral couldn't sleep. She walked the beach in fog, letting cold foam lick her ankles. Every wave seemed to hiss, "Liar, liar." Yet somewhere inside she clung to rationalizations. The community relied on C-Spark. The accident hadn't killed anyone. She would be better, safer, stricter. The ends justified the seams she'd hidden. Weeks passed. Autumn tourists trickled in. Orders returned. Coral mandated daily safety briefings, installed new ventilation, and paid overtime without quibbling. All part of her campaign to atone without confessing. But secrets, like improperly cooled glass, develop invisible fractures. Lena Shaw, a freelance journalist covering coastal industries, arrived on a drizzly November morning with a notebook full of questions. She believed C-Spark's miraculous reopening hid a deeper story. She interviewed Mara during a cigarette break. Mara, fatigued and underpaid, answered cautiously, but let comments slip. The kiln latch had been taped months before. The posted rules appeared after the inspection. Ben provided similar hints. Lena pieced them together and sought Dylan, who, carrying trays of holiday ornaments, claimed he was not authorized to talk. 3 days later, the article hit regional news sites. "Hot shop, hot mess, C-Spark safety shortcuts, endanger workers," sources say. It cited unnamed employees, discussed the taped interlock, highlighted inconsistencies between Coral's statements and OSHA guidelines. The headlines spread faster than molten glass on a cracked Marva. Customers cancelled workshops. A law firm contacted Dylan proposing litigation. Inspectors reopened their file. Coral gathered her staff in the showroom amid gleaming seascape sculptures. She tried to keep her voice steady. "We'll cooperate fully," she said. "Anyone approached by media, please direct them to me." Mara crossed her arms. "Maybe tell them the real story." Ben nodded. Others murmured agreement. Coral felt the orbit of control she'd spun begin to wobble. Her people were no longer pliable. They were cooling, stiffening, threatening to shatter. That evening, Coral drove to Dylan's rental cabin near the tide pools. He answered in sweats, inhaler tucked between fingers. "They're saying I might get settlement money," he told her before she spoke. "Enough to finish school anywhere, but it means giving a sworn statement." "You deserve tuition," Coral said. "I promised." "It's not about money now." His voice cracked. "It's about what really happened." Coral pictured herself on a witness stand, the taped censor entered into evidence, the insurance claims denied, the bank calling loans. Fear rose, but beneath it something else, the recognition that each lie had required more heat until the truth, like gas in a furnace, threatened to explode. She closed her eyes. "I disabled the interlock," she said softly. "I knew it was wrong. I thought I could manage the risk. I almost killed you. I'm sorry." Wind rattled the cabin's window. Dylan didn't speak. Perhaps he waited for another shaping, another spin. Coral remained silent, letting the confession cool in open air. At last he said, "If you testify to that, we all face consequences. But maybe people heal faster than businesses." She nodded. "Whatever happens, I'll accept it." He opened the door wider, invitation or dismissal she couldn't tell. She stepped into salty night, unsure whether she'd lost everything or finally set it down. Regulators returned. Coral handed over maintenance logs, including the real ones. She recounted under oath the shortcuts she'd taken, why she'd lied. Fines mounted, civil suits gathered, but criminal charges were mitigated by her cooperation and the fact that she'd voluntarily come clean. Seaspark closed for 6 months. Furnaces went cold, pipes stood idle. Coral sold 2 coastal properties to pay penalties and employees' severance. Theo took a manager position at a shipping warehouse, the steady paycheck keeping bills afloat. During the hiatus, Coral volunteered at a marine debris project, collecting beach glass and plastics for art students. The irony wasn't lost on her, recycling shards instead of making new. She spent evenings in a borrowed garage working with a single handheld torch, learning lamp-working techniques she'd once dismissed. Small, careful flames, slow, patient rotations. She crafted a series of hollow globes, each containing a tiny coloured spar, like an ember caught under water. When she'd finished 21, she mailed them to former employees, inspectors, even the journalist Lena. Inside every package lay a note. Glass remembers the fire that formed it. So do I. Thank you for holding me to the flame. Spring returned. With fresh permits and new equipment, Seaspark reopened, scaled down but compliant to the letter. The grand reopening demonstration drew a modest crowd, locals curious, tourists strolling by. Coral stood before the annealing kiln, now outfitted with redundant locks, proximity sensors, and a bright red sign-off checklist, and introduced her only apprentice, Dylan. He would demonstrate safe loading procedure. First rule, Dylan said, his voice amplified by a small headset. No one reaches past this threshold without the door guard engaged. He held up the guard, clipped it in place, slid trays along a steel rail. The kiln's elements dimmed automatically. He stepped back, pressed a button, and the door eased shut, sensors confirming clearance before power resumed. The audience clapped. Coral, watching from behind the rail, felt something loosen in her chest. Not pride, she no longer trusted that word, but humility, a cooler burning fuel. Afterward, she thanked Dylan. He shrugged. Glass teachers, some lessons hurt. They walked to the seawall, tasting the briny wind. The studio behind them hummed, steady and contained. Coral realized that shaping truth differed from shaping lies. You didn't impose form. You revealed it, coaxing what already existed. Like blowing a bubble, you provided breath, not blueprint. Seaspark would never be the same, and neither would she. Yet the tide kept rolling, glass kept cooling, and the horizon remained something you could look toward without blinking.